Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Marshall. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the chanting that you lead every week. And thank you all for being here. I got a few different topics I'm going to touch on tonight, and then hopefully it'll stimulate a little question in your minds, and you may bring those questions forward in question and answer time. Looking around this Zoom screen, there's probably a number of folks who come from a Jewish religion, grew up in the Jewish faith. Some of you might even still be practicing it. And today is the second day of Rosh Hashanah, which is considered in the Jewish calendar the New Year. So today is the day that people say in one language or another, they say Happy New Year. And I was wished Happy New Year a few times over the last couple of days, and it struck me the question that always strikes me: what does that mean, New Year? I grew up in the Jewish faith where September-ish, because it's on a lunar calendar, but this time of year would be the New Year. And even though I felt myself as just basically an American kid, and obviously the New Year was January 1st, it wasn't September 9th or 10th as it isn't this year. But there was also some logic to it in my mind because it was just when we went back to school, and it did have a feeling of a new year. So I found a way in my mind to relate to the fact that there were two New Years. Of course, as I got older and learned more about the world, I found out there were a lot more than two New Years. Most of us know in the Asian lunar calendar, the New Year is sometime late February, early March. I believe in the Persian calendar, it's just a little bit different. Theirs is more later March, maybe a little bit later. So depending on your tradition determines when the New Year is. So if we were to ask a Kungan, we might say, we all say January 1st is the New Year, but now we're talking about the New Year being on September 10th. So what is it? Is the New Year January 1st or September 10th? That raises don't know. Maybe those of you who have been into Kungan practice for a while, you have some answer that arises for you. And that's wonderful. To me, it reminds me of the very basic Kungan. Many of you have been around too long, you don't remember this Kungan. But very early on when we're teaching, I will hold up this glass. In fact, many of you have heard this question more recently. But we say, we call this a glass. But in China, they don't call it a glass. In Italy, they don't call it a glass. In France, they don't call it a glass. So to say it's a glass, we say you're attached to name and form. But if you tell me it's not a glass, then I say you're attached to emptiness. So without being attached to name and form, and without being attached to emptiness, what is this? This points us back to before thinking mind. That's the point. Our ideas, beliefs, and conditions create our reality. So if you grow up in Persia, I guess we call it Iran now, here in the United States at least, then you think, of course, New Year is sometime in March. If you grew up under a Jewish calendar system, you would think, of course, the New Year is early. Since it's lunar, it moves around. But it comes at this time of year, this new moon that's just arising now. If you grow up in Korea, well, Korea is mixed. They probably have both January 1st and the Lunar New Year. So all cultures make their own cultural system. But before the cultural system appears, what is it? Without the human mind, where does the new year come from? So I'm going to come back a little to this Jewish holiday, but this question of what is the new year reminded me of the story of Wan Hyo. Many of you who've read Dropping Ashes on the Buddha, you might remember the story of Wan Hyo in there. But I thought I would tell the story again and talk about it a little bit. And I'm going to tell it a little bit differently. Just this afternoon, I went on the web and I grabbed some information about Wan Hyo. If you're interested in biographical information, we can talk about that later. That's not really the point. But the story of Wan Hyo was that he grew up in a Buddhist family, and his great question was aroused. What is this? And Wan Hyo apparently he lived from 617 to 686. So we're talking about 1,500 years ago. So Wan Hyo's great question got aroused, and he did what most would do in Korea or even in Japan at that time. You find that it's time to go to China. Because in China, Zen practice, or Chan practice as it's called in China, was developed, and it was really a golden age of understanding and wisdom and explanation, that he was going to go to the source. So in the story that Zen Master Bon Soeng tells, he travels north in Korea to go to China. And in Zen Master Bon Soeng's story, he ends up at an oasis somewhere in a desert. I'd like to say what the story that I read today, they don't say it was an oasis. He actually went into a cave. And he went into the cave to find a safe place to sleep for the night. And of course, it was a cave and it was very dark. And he settled himself in and he was very thirsty. So he reached around and he felt this bowl or a cup. And he lifted the bowl or the cup and he drank the water out of the cup and he was satisfied. And with that, he went to sleep. The next morning he awakened, and he looked around and he noticed what he thought was a cave was a tomb. And what he thought was a cup was a skull. And the skull was like a fresh kill. There was still rotting meat on the skull. The liquid that had gathered in the skull had maggots in it. There was still blood on this skull. And he took one look at that and he threw up. He was so disgusted, he threw up and he ran as quickly as he could to get out of the cave, or which was actually a tomb. And of course, at that moment, as the story would go, he attained enlightenment. What did he get? This is a very important point. He understood that mind created his reality. The night before, he was comforted by the tomb, and he was refreshed by the liquid that he drank. His perception was all was good. The next morning, he realized he was totally disgusted and probably quite frightened by having slept in the tomb and drank this disgusting concoction that made him vomit. So he asked himself, why is it that when I thought it was water, it was and a good shelter in the cave, everything was wonderful. When I saw it was a tomb and liquid full of blood and maggots and fresh meat, he was so disgusted he threw up. Mind makes everything. And I think I want to read just a little bit here because I think they'll say it probably better than I can say it. And I'm going to read this a little bit out of order. But he says, in Juan Hyo's teaching, life is essentially like a glass of water. The water is simply water. What one adds to that water will make it taste bitter or sweet. But the water is just water. Each individual, therefore, is responsible for how their water tastes. Each of us is responsible for what we add to the water. Now I'm going to go backwards and read the paragraph before. His essential teaching is that perception shapes and defines the world one experiences. And I think to be more clear, you would say what you make of your perception shapes and defines the world one experiences. One's secular life or religious life is equally defined by one's interpretation of experience. The concept of true spirituality or a rejection of spiritual life is essentially the result of what one accepts as true in life. But, as Juan Hyo explains, that acceptance or rejection is entirely up to the individual interpretation and judgment. So that's the meaning of the phrase we use when we say mind makes everything. Water is just water. But in California, we're so starved for water. If it were to rain today, we would be ecstatic. A week ago or so, they had massive rains and floods in New Jersey and New York, and 13 people died. In New York and New Jersey, water was the villain. In California, it's God's gift to earth. Mind and conditions make everything. This story in Korean Buddhism, I've seen on walls, the exterior walls of temples in Korea are painted in all sorts of ways. Some of the ways they're painted is with paintings, depictions of important Buddhist events. And I have seen paintings on the walls of Juan Hyo grabbing this skull and drinking. It's that basic to Korean Buddhism. There's actually another story of Juan Hyo. Later on, when he had become a teacher, he decided to pay 5 young men to beat him up. And of course, the young men thought he was totally crazy, but he gave them the money, and they started pummeling him. And the story goes is that they pummeled him so much that all he could do is lay on the ground in a heap from being beaten up. And he looked up at the 5 young men, and he said, "You never touched me." Mind makes everything. That basic teaching is critical. So when we ask the question, what am I? We're looking into, on one level at least, that's a multi-dimensional question. But on one level, we're looking into the question, how do I interpret reality? What do I add to water? And what do I call it? Is it sweet or is it salty? Is sweet better than salty? Some people like salty, some people like sweet. But each of us have our opinion, our desire. And then we go one more step and we shape our lives in order to get what we want. So Juan Yo points the practitioner back to things as they are, undifferentiated. Our minds make good, bad, right, wrong. Even in the physical world, tree, bush, grass, all of it gets differentiated. But what Juan Yo taught was everything is one thing. The distinctions and differentiations come from our minds. And first we make the distinction, then we have an opinion about the distinction, then we have an opinion about other people whose opinion is different than ours, then we find like-minded people to join with, then we grab the group together and fight the other people who don't see it our way. That's the human condition. Zen takes us back to the root. Where does this come from? It arises out of the attachment to our own interpretations of our perceptions. Those interpretations are quite subtle. Some of them we see right away. Others we need to get hit over the head with over and over and over again in order to discover them. People used to go to Zen Master Bon and ask him questions about their life. What should I do? And he would tell them. Well, guess how many people actually did what he said? Not so many. And Zen Master Bon was prepared for that. They would come back to him and tell them once again of his plight. And his response would be, more suffering is necessary. How much suffering do you need to wake up? How many times do we buy into the stories that we create in our mind, mistake those stories for reality, and then act on them in ways that create suffering for ourselves and others? How many ways do our unconscious expectations, beliefs, and feelings color us in a way that make us act in ways that aren't helpful to either ourselves and others? And as I've been thinking about this, I realized in a funny way, this is the point where Zen practice and a psychotherapeutic practice come together. They have the same point, which is to understand our karma. Part of our practice is to deconstruct the way our minds operate. In order to do that, we have to be observant. We have to notice. We have to notice the things that we privilege. We have to notice the way our desires impact our behaviors. We have to be aware that even though we passionately believe it's true, and we even act on it, at the very same time, we need to leave some doubt, because we know that our ideas and our opinions can lead us astray. What I'm saying is not judgmental. It's not being critical. It's just the simple observation of how mind colors reality and how then we act as if that colored reality is real and perpetuate our suffering over and over again for self and for other. So there's the awakening of everything is one thing. That awakening changes our life. That realization opens us to the path. But we're not done. We need to thoroughly investigate, root out, if you will, the misperceptions, the misconceptions, the tainted views, the conditioned views. You know, one of the points it makes in this webpage that I printed out here was that most of what we know comes from what other people tell us. The expectations that get set for us are, especially when we're quite young, become the map of our lives. Fundamentally, that map is false. Following that map continues our life in a dream. The ability and the power of waking up is letting go, even for a moment, of our conditioned concepts and ideas to be able to just simply taste the water. We all have had some semblance of an experience where we know that we fit into something bigger than us. And if we really look at it, it's very difficult to find the boundary between my small experience and the immensity of this universe. Just take a look at some of the photos that come from the Hubble spacecraft. They're now detecting these large forces, energy forces that impact galaxies so far away we can't really even imagine the distances. And yet they seem to be impacted by the same things and spin in very similar ways. The tiny little bacteria that's living in our gut thinks our gut is the entire universe. And every once in a while, food comes down the tube and lands. And suddenly it's time for me to eat. That's my life. That's all I know. All each one of us knows is the reality of the human experience as it is in the moments of our life. We don't really know what it was like for Wan Hyo. You know, we think the Buddha lived about 2,600 years ago. And I don't know the exact date of the Jewish calendar, but it's something like 5778 or 9 or somewhere in there. 5,700 and let's say 80 years of recorded history. Human beings have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. And of course, our descendants go back to the beginning of time. We think we're different than the apes who we co-developed with. But it's just one branch on a much bigger tree. And in many ways, Wan Hyo's enlightenment was to be able to just experience the tree, just as it is. To just hear these words and not make anything. Easy to say, a lifelong practice to do. So maybe just to conclude, I'll go back to the holiday of the Jewish New Year, which has 3 parts to it. The first is the first day or the second day, which is called the New Year. And then my favorite is the 10 days of awe that happen next. Now, I'm sure there's many ways to interpret that, but I would say to live in awe or with awe is to live a Zen practice. When we sat and meditated tonight, can we bring awe into our experience? And if we allow that awe, it's a funny word, isn't it? And what's really interesting to me is we have the word awful, full of awe, and we interpret that as horrible. But I'm actually saying that to be full of awe is to be fully alive. Because that's living with great doubt. That's not just living with great doubt, that's being great doubt. And I think part of these 10 days of awe, or actually living a life infused with awe, is grappling with the reality of our life experience. You know, part of what's happening in the Jewish ritual in these days of awe is it's the last 10 days before God closes the book of life for the next year. So you're really in a time of repentance. You're in a time of owning up to maybe the harm that you've done in your life, and maybe even owning up to your own hubris. But I think for our purposes, it may simply say to be honest with what is, and to notice and to own all the ways we're not honest, all the ways we act outside. It's hard to say this. We have certain values and sense of what's right, and then we act in ways that are outside of that. Own it. Usually we can't bear it, so we just turn away. To live with awe, in some ways, means to turn toward. And to use that phrase again, to own it. If we can own it, we can deal with it. If we can't own it, we just perpetuate it. So to have the courage, we're always talking about great courage and great effort, to have the courage to spend time owning up to our own experience and our own behavior and our own action. And remember, Wan Hyo's everything is one thing, everything is one mind. And if we can drop into that, then it's not about good and bad, right and wrong. It's just what is. And then the holiday ends with the last day in the tradition. It's called Yom Kippur, and it's a day of repentance. It's your last chance. Could you imagine living a life where you really believed that this moment is your chance? And if you miss this moment, you miss your chance. Now, I know I'm making something with that statement, but imagine a life that this moment is the moment. This moment. And in some ways, we can say that's repentance. Repentance isn't only I'm sorry. Repentance is owning it. Repentance is seeing its origins. Repentance is taking a vow to do better. I'm using words of good and bad. It's very tricky to speak without falling into opposites, but I think you get the gist. It's not about good and bad. It is about being alive right now and owning up to the reality of your experience. It's very easy to talk about. From my experience, it's not so easy to do. So we practice. In fact, I want to just tag on one thing at the end of this talk, and it just occurred to me as I was thinking about all this, the power and the value of ritual. And one of the more difficult aspects to online practice is the falling away of ritual. You know, look around. Marshall went and got his robes. Casey comes with his robes. And I wear my robes because I'm giving a talk. Nobody else bothers. And no mistake, nobody's asked you to. And in many ways, until before this pandemic, I always thought, these robes, I have an ambivalent relationship to the robes. But taking away the robes lets me once again feel the value of putting on the robe. Just that simple bow. I gave interviews last night, and I give interviews a lot online, and we've lost so much of the ritual of interviews. People are surprised when I bow to begin the interview. When we do it live, there's so much form. People come into the room and they do a full prostration to the teacher. And once again, I'll admit my ambivalence to being the person who's being bowed to. But I also know that I had no problem bowing when I was the student coming in. It's actually, for me at least, more difficult as the person being bowed to than being the person who does the bowing. In fact, we're both bowing. We just have different jobs in that bow. But it's a reminder to myself and all the rest of us that it's fine to put the ritual aside. But remember that ritual helps us stay engaged and present on our path. That putting on the robe reminds us of what we're doing when we're meditating. And that simple bow reminds us to be humble, reminds us to be open and receptive rather than closed and opinionated. For the most part, everybody is different, but for the most part, we close down to protect ourselves. There's some very vulnerable core. So it's not so easy to open up. But if we don't open, we're really not getting the fruits of our practice. Because it takes vulnerability to actually recognize what's true and to take steps to live in accord with the way. So find your true New Year. Stay open. See if you can find some awe. And allow yourself to be part of the one mind and the one taste.